And let me open up the PowerPoint. So yeah, we are reading Revelation chapter 18. So if you want to look it up in your Bibles, you can do that. And we're gonna try to go through all of it. If we get into a good discussion and it seems like it's going slow, then maybe we'll read half or something like that and leave the other half for next week. But we'll try. So chapter 17, we had the woman, right, sitting on this scarlet beast, and we have, the 10 horns and these 10 empires, and there's a lot of different explanations or a lot of possibilities that they have here. Revelation 18 is actually a lot more straightforward, I would say. And it's I think, at least to me, it's a very important one when it comes to Adventism because it's very much connected to the three angels' message, right? If you remember the three angels' message, the first one is the eternal gospel, right? The idea that we have to share to the whole world the good news about Jesus, and it includes the Sabbath and things like that. And then the second and third angels' messages is all about how Babylon is fallen and to get out of Babylon, right? Chapter 18 is very, very similar to the second and third angel, all right? In fact, what's interesting about chapter 18 is that it kind of gives us a more in-depth look at what exactly Babylon is fallen means, right? What exactly does that entail? And it's going to give us details and things like that. So it's a good one to read. So let's jump right in.
Question, Pastor.
Go ahead, Lynette.
Isn't Babylon fell in chapter 17? Wasn't it? It fell there.
Well, if you remember in chapter 17, the angel says, "I'll show you the judgment of the harlot," right?
Okay.
Who is Babylon, right? The mother of harlots. What we're reading in chapter 18 is the actual, I guess, how it's going to happen. It's giving us a bit more. It's a continuation of 17. It very much is. So in verse 17, it talks about, I'm going to show you the judgment of the harlots, right? Who's named Babylon. But if you actually read through 17, most of it isn't about the judgment. Most of it is actually just about, okay, who is this woman? Who's the beast? Who's the horns? And so on. Only at the very end does it say that, those 10 kingdoms, those 10 horns, is going to turn against the woman and destroy her, right? Yeah. Chapter 18 is that little section there. Okay, what exactly does that mean? What, that destruction of the harlot, how is that going to happen? And this is really what we're reading here in chapter 18. It's a detailed version of those few verses, all right?
Chapter 17, they talk about the 7 hills, and they call that Rome.
Yeah,
and
so that
18, they call it city, famous city.
Yeah. So if you remember last week we gave you the traditional view is exactly what you said, right? The 7 hills, we know Rome is actually known as the city on 7 hills. And we know Rome is the center of misinformation, right? It's where they've changed laws. It's where they've changed the Bible and created all of these different things, which creates this confusion, right? Which then it talks about as kind of that wine that she gives to the nations, right? She gets them drunk on these false ideas, false laws, false ways of living, and so on. So chapter 18 again is just a continuation of that.
Okay.
All right. So let me read the first 2 verses here, and then we can go on. After these things, so right there, right at the beginning, it says after these things, which means that this is directly connected to chapter 17, right? He just saw chapter 17, and this is what happens right after that, right? So after these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his glory. All right. So again, this goes right back to the 3 angels message. Every time you have an angel of God coming down to earth, you have to remember, hello, Ken and
sorry, we were
no problem, no problem. Yeah, we just began. We're just at the beginning, so you haven't missed anything. But if you remember the three angels' message, yeah, so anytime an angel comes down to earth, it means that there's a message coming down to earth, right? Because the word angel simply means messenger, right? It simply means the messenger of God. And so this angel coming down from heaven is simply a physical way of saying there's a message that's coming down to earth. And as we read it, you're going to see it's directly connected to the three angels' message, right? So it says that this angel has great authority, which actually means that the message has authority, right? This is a message from God, and that the earth is illuminated by his glory. In other words, the message that he's bringing to the world is going to take away some of that darkness, is going to take away some of that confusion, and it's going to light up the earth with truth, in that sense. So this is the message that he gives. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, verse 2, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. All right, so this is very strong language. This is, he's bringing right into it that the message, right, the teachings of Babylon are directly connected to demons, to foul spirits. The idea of the unclean or the hated birds, that's always connected to judgment, right? Because these unclean birds, they pick at the dead, kind of a thing. It appears several times in Revelation. But this is something that we've been actually talking about since the beginning of Revelation, right? Revelation is about making a choice. Revelation is about either choosing God or choosing a false worship. And that's come in different forms, right? Even including the church itself. When we went through the seven churches, you'll know that by the time we get to, the fourth church, it's already changed, right? It's already teaching these falsehoods and these lies and these things. And basically what this angel is saying is all of those messages, all of those untruths, that just doesn't come from the minds of men. This isn't just an accident that happens or whatever. This is something that was directly directed by evil spirits, by Satan, right? He's done this on purpose to confuse the world, to put the world in darkness. And this Babylon. So when it talks about that Babylon is fallen, there's two ways of looking at it. And I believe that in Revelation, both actually apply. So the first one, which is kind of the traditional one, is the idea that, listen, this Babylon power, this Babylon message, um, is going to die one day, right? It's going to be destroyed, which we read a little bit about in chapter 17, right? Those 10 kings are going to turn on the harlot, are going to turn on this Babylon, mother of harlot power. So we know that it symbolizes the fact that this power will not last forever, right? Just like the statue, just like the animals, there's powers that come and they go. They come and they go. God puts them in place. God takes them out of place. And finally, like the statue of again, one day there's only going to be one empire, and that's God's empire, right? Jesus as our king, and so on. So that's the first interpretation of Babylon is fallen. The fact that, listen, these, and you take it in a plural, these nations that follow this confusion, that follow these false teachings, they will fall, right? They aren't going to rule forever. They're not going to be on top of people forever. The second way of interpreting this, which I think we mentioned last week, is the idea that, and this connects with the harlot idea, and you see this a few times in the Old Testament. So God kind of chooses this woman, this pure woman, right? It's found in Ezekiel, and he gives her everything she needs, and she's this pure woman. But then she begins prostituting herself with other nations, right? She begins changing who she is. She begins changing her ideas, her laws, and so on. So the other interpretation of Babylon is fallen is the fact that, these nations used to be good. right? They used to be God serving and following God's path, but they've polluted themselves, right, with these false teachings, with these false ideas, and they've fallen in that respect. So you went from being pure to being fallen. Very, very similar to the seven churches, right? So you look at the first church, this pure white church, right? And then slowly you see it decay and fall until it's considered this dead church, right? So that's the second interpretation of this is you used to be good, and there's people that are there because it used to be good, and yet God is warning the people, listen, this power is fallen. It's no longer what it used to be, or no longer stands what it it says that it stands for, right? And so there's two ways of seeing that. And so instead of it following God's laws and being full of the Spirit and goodness, it's now full of demons and foul spirits and uncleanliness, kind of a thing. Does that make sense? Any questions on that in the first two verses? Or anything to add to that?
Well, I know this particular message was given in Revelation 14, Babylon has fallen. And this seems to be a last call,
Yeah.
a call that is very important. You might have mentioned that. And the angel is illuminated with glory. And so it tells that this is a message that is very important, something we have to listen to, even though it was given before. Now this is the last call.
Yeah.
And so the take on Babylon is, when I look at the Old Testament, and I look at the examples used by for example, in the Old Testament by apostles, they regarded Rome as Babylon at one time, in the time of Peter and so on. And it would seem that this Babylon, there's something the principles, like the first Babylon in the Old Testament with Nebuchadnezzar, it was the center of the empire. Mm-hmm. And this particular Babylon was, as we will find here, it's very important. It's ruling the world, so to speak, in those days. Mm-hmm. And it's a great trader, and it is promoting these false ideas, false doctrines, particularly the idea that the empire of Babylon is going to last forever. Everything against what God had opened to Nebuchadnezzar. And I think this is giving us a similar idea that this particular nation that is influencing the entire world is, I think, doing something very similar. And as we go into a little more into the chapter itself, we will find that there are some similarities that we can pinpoint today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What we're going to see in chapter 18, and Lynette, that's why I was saying that this is kind of like an expansion of the previous chapter, right? He's getting kind of right into that details and giving us a lot of extra information. What we're going to see is that this power isn't just a religious power, right? It's not boxed into just a religious thing. It's connected to other empires, right? So it's connected to other countries, so it's political. It's connected to the economy because it's going to talk about buying and selling and trading and all of these things. So this very much this is a power that has kind of fingers in everything, right? Like Ken was saying, it very much is kind of ruling the world in that it's connected to everything and has a way of manipulating and kind of guiding everything below it, right? So it's almost like this umbrella power, right? So there's nations, but there's kind of like this nation above the nations, right? And it's very similar to if you go back in history to something like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Where you had countries, you had France and Spain and Italy and all these things, but there was like a power above the powers, right? There was this kind of overlooming entity that had to say yes or no to whatever, right? Had to give the okay. And this seems to be kind of something very similar to that. It's this Babylon power, right? This influencer that is able to really control everything below it. But as we keep reading, you're going to see that. So let's keep doing that. Does someone want to read verse 3 for us?
For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury.
All right. So this is you get a bit of a hint already, right? The idea that it's connected to kings, or again, remember, this was written during the time of John, so there really only was kings. So you know, nowadays you could probably replace that with, you know, presidents, prime ministers. This is talking about the rulers of nations, right? Which in those days there really only was kings. So this is a power that's very much connected politically with other nations, and not just connected, but actually has the power to influence or pollute them through her fornication, right? Through her meddling with them and this wine that she gets them to drink, right? That usually that wine, because remember, wine makes you do bad things, right? It makes you not be of your own mind and so on. So usually the wine is represented as like her ideas, her teachings, her laws, everything that kind of takes you away from what's right, from what's good, and this idea of confusion and, you know, kind of like when you're drunk, you don't see straight and so on. So that's really what that wine represents. It's those teachings and that way of living that she's able to influence other nations to follow suit, right? So Louise, you asked if it's Rome. Definitely in the past it was, right? So again, you look at something like the Holy Roman Empire during the time of John, absolutely Rome, and that includes pagan Rome and papal Rome. They were definitely kind of that power now. It's possible that this is still talking about Rome, but I think we also have to understand that it might be bigger than Rome, right? It might be a kind of, Rome is probably a part of it, but to have this kind of influence, you're talking about a very powerful entity, right? Who is, you know, literally able to control kings and so on. So it could be, or it could be kind of an amalgamated power. So when we talk about Babylon, it's, well, even when you know, when you take Nebuchadnezzar, for instance, so if you take it in Daniel, so when we talk about Babylon, Babylon was actually bigger than Babylon, right? Babylon conquered other nations, which kind of took its name as Babylon. And so something similar could be happening here. So there's probably like a centralized power, but it probably includes kind of other connected powers to it, if that makes sense, right? Like an amalgamation or a unity, something that's kind of going on here. Because again, when you actually read through what chapter 18 is saying, when this power gets disrupted, the whole world suffers, right? Every nation, every market, every economy, everything falls because of this one, you know, entity that falls, right? So you look at here, it's connected to kings, right? It controls and manipulates kings, but it also manipulates the merchants, and riches, right? So it's connected to the economy. It's connected to currencies and stock markets and, you know, all of this, you know, this global trade and stuff like that. It has power and influence over those things. And in fact, it makes them rich through her own luxury, right? So she's a power that actually creates wealth, right? It's a power that actually creates wealth. Any comments here on verse 3?
And how does she creates wealth? Through her fornication and prostitution?
She creates wealth through her connections, probably, right? Because she's connected to kings. And if you're any way connected to economies nowadays, if you listen to the news and stuff like that, the biggest wealth right now is in the trade between countries, right? That's how you become rich. It's through trade, with China and US and India and places, things like that. That's how you grow your wealth. You don't grow your wealth within your own country, right? You can only grow so far. If you really want to make wealth, you got to expand outside of your own borders. And this empire seems to have the ability to do that, right? Because it controls so many kings and rulers, it has the ability to create deals and wealth and this global economy that they talk about nowadays. Ken, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, I think one easy way to look at this base figure we're looking at with the harlot is to go back quickly and look at Daniel's Nebuchadnezzar's image, as I mentioned the other day. So Nebuchadnezzar's image is Nebuchadnezzar interested in knowing what would become of his kingdom in the future.
Yeah.
And God gave him this dream. And he shows the succeeding nations after Babylon, right down to the ending of time. And he uses specific nations or empires like Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. That's the first four empires. And then Daniel saw the foot of the image. It was clay and iron. And so if every material introduced is an empire, then the clay must represent something else, another empire to come.
Yeah.
So this vision that John is having here, it's telling us the same thing that was told to Nebuchadnezzar. So, but John is using these animals that was introduced by Daniel. So he replaces the metal parts with four animals. And here we see this combination of all these animals is represented by this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something else that's missing. And I think as I read, what I believe is missing is the last empire that represents clay. I believe that empire is the same as Babylon that rides the beast. So all of this together gives us a structure that is equal to what Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at a structure at the ending of time that is very similar to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We have to keep that in mind, and it makes things a lot easier as we look at it.
Yeah, and just going with that same idea. So, the traditional view is we always use Rome, right? But we have to remember that even when we get to the clay, there's still the iron in there, right? So there is still these connections to Rome within it. And that's why I said, I think Rome can be a part of it. I think it's in there, but I think we have to realize, and again, it actually tells us, right? It's things that don't mix together. So there is two parts there, not to mention, the 10 toes, 10 horns, and those things like that. So we know it's this amalgamation. When we talk, if you go back to chapter 17, for instance, you'll remember that those 10 horns, which represent 10 kings, they work in unison, right? There's this unity that's created, this amalgamation of power, which then causes this end to happen. And so that's why we're saying, I agree with the traditional in terms that, yeah, Rome is definitely a part. It's there. But I think you almost have to zoom out a little bit and realize that there's also other players connected which are influencing what's going on, right? And if you were to look at the world today, for instance, the two biggest countries that influence nations, that influence the economy and things like that, it's the US and China, right? Those are the two superpowers that if they do something, the whole world changes, right? So, for instance, when the housing market went down in the States, the whole world went into depression. When China pulls back its development, the whole world suffers. So, I mean, I think you can see that, yes, I believe Rome is there, but there's other countries that are working together to create this influence, because that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a power that has the influence to control kings and to control economies, right? So it's it's an amalgamational power that's able to just run the world, right? And we kind of talk about this, right? The idea that there's got to be people that make the decisions, right, outside of countries and so on, um, for the things to happen the way they do, right? We know that there's kind of the power above the power, and that's really what we seem to be reading here, because this is a worldwide controlling entity. It controls kings, it controls markets, and so on. All right, does that make sense, Lynette?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Let's keep reading because there's quite a few verses here. And we're going to try, anyways, to read it all. Verses 4 to 6. Does someone want to read this here for us?
And I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works in the cup which she has mixed double for you."
All right, so this you get quite a few important verses here, right? Kind of a couple of really important things. You'll see that we get the third and second angel's message in this message, right? So it's not just Babylon has fallen, but also come out of her, my people, right? It's literally word for word what you read there in Revelation 14. And that's why when we go back to that original statement, Babylon has fallen, it obviously hasn't completely fallen, right? Because you still have this very, very last chance. Very similar. Well, Ken, you mentioned it, right? The idea that we're talking about the very kind of that last chance, right? Because it's basically saying, you can almost imagine it as, listen, the walls are already coming down, so get out as quickly as you can. Babylon has fallen, but there's still this last chance to come out of her. You'll also notice right at the end of verse 4 that it mentions the plagues, right? And we know that that's the order. We know that there's this accumulation. We know that this power comes into effect, changes laws, including something like the Sunday law and so on. And finally, it falls. We know that the doors of probation close, and then the plagues come in, right? So we're getting a very clear kind of chronology of what has to happen. Babylon falls, and that's when the plagues hit the earth. All right. So if you're kind of wondering where does everything fit in the timeline, that's what we're seeing here. So this is that last moment, that last final message, which is why it says that the angel is illuminated and so on, right? It's that last shining light on the earth for people to choose the right, choice and avoid those 7 last plagues, right? Avoid really condemnation, right? Is what we're talking about here, right? At the end of this message, the world is divided eternally by their choice. Those who've accepted and those who remain in the world, right? In Babylon. So that's the time period that we're looking at here. Any questions here about verses 4 to 6 or comments?
One of the things that I like, and I recall from the story given in the Old Testament about the fall of Babylon. If you remember the story when Babylon was to be destroyed by the Persians, that they were warned before. God warned in the scriptures, Isaiah and Ezekiel. But what was interesting is that God's people did not suffer as a result of the fall. They were spared. Babylon fell, and they were protected as God had promised. And I think the same way, if we trust the Lord at the ending of time, we will have the same protection as He protected His own people when Babylon in the Old Testament fell. And it's something we must keep in mind, that always as we look to God for protection and deliverance and safety, he will do the same as he did in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that's important to remember, and we've talked about this last week, but we're going to emphasize it again. So in verse 6, it talks about that judgment, right? And the idea of rendering judgment upon Babylon. Babylon, throughout history, whether it's literally Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, Egypt, Assyria, all of those nations kind of represent Babylon, right? They were nations that were against God's people. They all killed God's people, right? And if you remember very early on in Revelation, there's that scene at the altar where the martyrs are asking God, how long until we get our justice, until, our lives, we get justice for that, for them taking away our lives. That's what we're reading here in verse 6. God is saying, listen, judgment has come. And the lives that she's taken is going to come back on her. And in fact, God says he's going to mix it double, right? She's going to get double the punishment for what she's did. But realize, and you see this throughout the Bible, right? Realize that just because God passes the judgment, it doesn't mean that God does it himself, right? We always talk about the idea of God simply taking away protection, right? We know God protects the good and the bad right now. We know that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. The day will come, however, where God will finally say, okay, I've been with the world, I've given them chances, I've had the door open, but now that that's closed, it's time for judgment. It's time for them to receive their reward. This is what they chose, and this is what they're going to receive. It doesn't mean that God does it directly, but God allows things to happen, right? But what's important is, and this you find throughout Revelation, every single time justice is served, so whether it's in the trumpets, whether it was the plagues and so on, there's always someone, an angel or something appears that says everything that's happening is not unjust. Everything that is happening is just because God is just. He's not going overboard. He's not he's not full of rage or vengeance or anything like that. He is simply doing what a judge does. He is passing his judgment, right? He's letting the people's actions have their consequence, all right? So that's something that the Bible repeats, especially in Revelation, over and over and over again. When God does pass judgment, and he will, that's a promise, right? Even Jesus talks about this. God will pass judgment, right? But it's just. It's not God being angry. It's not God being vengeful. It is simply God giving what people have asked for, right? That's the choice. Do you want to accept God and live, or do you want to stay in the world and die with the world? So when people die, it's their choice, right? It's their consequence to their actions. Does that make sense? Does verse 6? Do you understand that? Any comments or questions about these verses here?
There's one particular one that this is in verse 4 when it says, "Come out of her, my people." One commentary stresses the my people not just as a Christian community, but a call to all the peoples in the world,
Absolutely.
across the world,
Yeah.
to come out from the deeds that this particular Babylon is committing, and the ideology of Babylon. So separate yourself from these things.
Yeah.
But it's what I like. It's not an address to one particular special group, but to everybody. God is calling everybody to separate themselves from these things.
And what's important there is that God's already calling them my people, right? Like he's chosen them. And go ahead, Yvonne, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, how would they know if these are not the practicing Christians, or
but
is that where we fall short?
No, that's where we come in, right? That's where our job comes in. Again, at the beginning where it says, let me flip back here. So where it says, after these things, I saw another angel coming down. That's us. That's our work, right? God has given us a message. and we're supposed to give it with authority. That's what it's, it says great authority, and it's supposed to illuminate the world. That's our job, right? We have to give the message with authority, not, well, I think it's this or maybe. No, you have to say, no, this is what God wants. This is what God expects. This is what God can do for you. And it's to give light to the world, right? It's through that light that the people will come out, right? So this is, yeah, it's absolutely us, Yvonne. Unfortunately, I agree with what you said. It's our fault because we're probably not doing it enough, right? That's where
Yeah.
we're falling short.
Right.
But no, that this is the message. This is just a repeat of the three angels' message. That's really what we're reading here. God is just giving that final, message to us.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, but when you read Revelation, 18:2, the mere fact that this angel is mighty and cried with a loud voice and illuminates the earth means that somehow this message will be vibrant and given throughout the world.
Yeah.
And it will be very significant because people will respond. Many will come to know and will respond. And as you mentioned, it is mighty. We're the ones who are giving the message.
Yeah.
And it's a very important message, one that has a tremendous amount of significance, and people will respond.
Yeah.
And that's why it goes to my people, all of the people in the world.
And
The
if
reason
you're
why
enjoying
I
it,
said anything was that I find that, including myself, we tend to shy away from talking to people about it. And that's
Yeah.
why I said that.
Yeah.
We
You're
study
right.
all we want, but when do we tell people about it?
And
How do we
and
meet people?
let
You
me give
know?
you a testimony there. It's interesting. I was just talking with an old member of mine, and he wanted to sell his lawnmower, and this man showed up. They contacted. He came over, and he said literally every second word was a swear word from this man.
Oh dear.
Right? Like just a very just brute kind of, but they were talking. After a while, my friend started introducing, like what's happening in the world and so on. And he finally mentioned Jesus, right? He brought Jesus into the conversation. And in his head, he was like, okay, he's going to leave now, right? Like this is because he had been talking to him for almost an hour already, right? And so he's okay, now he's going to go. Here's this man, this, very rough on the outside, swearing all these things. He spoke to him about Jesus for over half an hour.
Yeah.
People are very, very open right now
Yeah.
to hear, because the fact is, and I don't think we understand this as Adventists. See, we've been, raised up with these prophecies, knowing that these things have to happen, knowing about the trials and the hard times and things like that. Most people in the world don't know that, right? They truly believe that the world will go back to normal, that it'll go back to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, life will just continue on. And with these pandemics and with the fires and the floods and everything that's going on in the world, people are starting to realize that maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe life doesn't go back to normal, and it's scaring them. People are honestly afraid of tomorrow. They don't know what's going to happen. And
Yeah.
and so when you talk about God, a person that 2 years ago would have brushed you off, that person's listening now. That person wants to know, well, listen, do you know what's going on? Yeah, like, does the Bible actually talk about this? And people will listen. It's amazing how much more open people truly are to hear this message, right? The one that we're talking about, this angel, right? And when you read something like verse 4, when it says, come out of her, my people, we really have to believe this. We can't just look at a certain group and say, oh, well, they're Muslims, they'll never convert. Or they're Jews, or they're Hindus, or they're from a different country. They're not going to. God is making it very, very clear. I have people everywhere. There are people that will listen to you, that will accept this message, and that will be saved because you took that chance, right? You took that chance to speak with them, to talk to them. So this is an important message. And again, it's not an angel that's going to do the work. It's us. We're the angels. We're the messengers.
Yeah, we know what the answer is, and
Yeah.
that's why most of them are saying it is global warming. What's happening? But we know it's not only that. We know it's the end time coming.
Exactly.
You know,
So
I just want to make this point that it's not just outside of our circle, like when I say a circle, because within our circle, there are people, you know, who I was quite surprised who still swear and things like that. So
we're all on different paths, Yvonne. We're all in different stages.
Well, this is what I'm saying. It sounds like it's outside we have to reach.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. But inside as well.
Yeah. Again, when you look at Jesus, right? What does he say to his disciples? Listen, start in Jerusalem. You know, you got to start at home, then go to the surrounding, then it's the world. So you're absolutely right. You know, the message is for everyone. It's for us just as much as it is for the outside.
Everybody.
Yeah.
So I like Louis' comment on the global warming, because that's something that we are experiencing right now. But it is interesting that the global warming, all we can do is to maybe slow it down a little bit. But we know at the ending of time, based on what Revelation 7 says, that the impact of global warming cannot really be stopped. Maybe slowed down a little bit, but it cannot be stopped based on Revelation 7.
Yeah.
And along with the global warming is a lack of food, shortage of water, and those compound the whole problem. And I mean, God is telling us those are things that come long before we know about global warming, 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. Like, again, you know, the Bible teaches us this stuff. It teaches us that it's not just wars. It's going to be worldwide, you know, pollution and catastrophes, but it's also going to be diseases. It's also going to be pandemics. It's also going to, you know, the Bible's shown us all of these things. And that's where, and I hate to say it, but, you know, a lot of us, I think, are hoping that life is going to go back to normal. And, you know, you read the Bible, I don't see it. You know, I think the pandemic can end, but to be honest, I think something else is going to come up before it even has a chance to end. We're reaching a part in history where things are speeding up, right? Natural disasters and diseases and all, it's speeding up, and it's just going to be one thing after another. And the idea that you're just going to live your life and raise a family and have your home and go to work and just live without any sort of that type of world, I don't see that coming back. I think the world has changed forever, and it's going to slowly keep getting worse.
Yeah, well, I think that we know that Satan is doing this, but God is giving him, God is showing us that it's time for us to turn back to him. He can stop it.
Yeah, Louise, we that's what we've been reading all of these weeks, right? God is allowing these things to happen to wake us up, right? He knows that if unfortunately, as human beings, we have to see the negative to open up our eyes, right? It's like that analogy of, you know, you put a frog in water and you start boiling the water. If it goes slowly, the frog won't jump out. It'll just cook. But if you drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps, right? And unfortunately, as humans, we seem to be the same. When things happen slowly, you know, kind of, we don't notice it. We kind of, we get used to it. And so I think God has to allow these big, shocking events to wake us up and say, listen, these things it's happening, right? These events are going on, and we're getting very close to the end, right? All right, let's keep going, because I don't think we're ever going to finish this chapter the way we're going.
No, I don't think so.
Let's read verses 7 and 8. Anyone want to read this?
In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her.
All right. So again, very, very strong wording here, right? It's interesting what Babylon says. You know, she says, "I sit as a queen, and I am no widow." Right? So she truly believes she's at the top of the world. You know, nothing can take her down. Very similar to Nebuchadnezzar. If you remember, if you read the story again, you know, there was that time where he looked around and said, "Man, I'm the king of kings. You know, I'm the best man in the world." And that very day, you know, and you get that same parallel here. Within that one day, the plagues fall. Within that one day, he loses everything, right? He ends up eating grass like a cow. Um, and that seems to be what we're seeing here, right? So this power at its peak, right? You know, as we get closer to the end, it's going to seem unbeatable. It's going to seem like you know, this thing that's going to rule forever. And yet that very day, that same day, everything falls at once. Death and mourning and famine and burning, and you know, God uses all these different words to explain her destruction. Um so for me, it gives me hope. You know, you watch the world, you watch the news, and it seems as if the crooked people always win, right? When you look around, it looks like those that cheat and those that steal and those that lie, those are the ones that always prosper, right? And what I'm reading here is, listen, it might look that way, but the day will come when all of that comes to an end, right? All of these falsehoods, all of this wine that she's giving out, all of that's going to come to an end. And suddenly, you know, when she least expects it. Any comments or questions, verses 7 and 8?
Well, as you mentioned, it reminds me, these words of Babylon reminds us of the Babylon in Nebuchadnezzar's day.
Mm-hmm.
And she seems to have the same attitude that she is the great power, influence in the world, and that nobody could remove her. And that's why I guess Nebuchadnezzar, when he made the image all of gold to say that nobody's going to stop this kingdom. This kingdom will exist until the ending of time, right through. And this Babylon is having the same idea that she will continue to exist as a leader of all nations.
Yeah.
And it is sad because it says she's doing some real awful things. And I think for those who commit themselves to God will have to realize that they'll go through a lot of torment and trial and difficulties. But if we trust the Lord, he will, as we look at the churches, he says, if you're faithful to me until death, you wouldn't taste a second death, or you'll have the crown of life. And we need to be faithful to God. But at the same time, we need to not lift our hands, do anything that is physical against anyone, but trust the Lord. We know what will happen. We know he'll take us through, and we know we'll be safe with him.
Yeah.
Do you know what she means? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Yvonne, go ahead.
No, I was asking, why would it be important for her to say she's no widow?
She's not lost anything, right? Like she's the top. It could also mean that she doesn't even need a king, right? Like she's the top. She's a queen, but she's never had a king, right? It's not like he's died or anything like that. She is simply the top.
Okay.
So self-confident and such self-sufficiency that she doesn't need God. God doesn't, come into the picture. She is dependent on herself.
Self-supporting. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And she also said she will not see sorrow.
Right.
That's what she believes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, Nebuchadnezzar said the same thing, right? Herod had said the same thing. Belshazzar said the same thing. It seems to be something very bad to say, right? Don't
tired.
Don't claim that you don't need God and that everything's okay. It actually reminds me of the Titanic, right? One of the famous lines is, Even God can't sink this ship.
That's right.
That's definitely not something you want to say on your maiden voyage. But I think that's the whole point of it,
And he
right?
didn't sink it. He didn't sink it.
And he didn't sink it. It was an
iceberg. It's simple as a piece of ice.
It was man-made errors, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
So for me, what's important is, and it goes back to what Ken was saying too, we are going to suffer in this world, right? We are going to go through injustices, right? Things are going to happen to us, and we're going to say, well, that's not fair, right? I did nothing wrong. He's lying or he's cheating. And, I just know of a family that, they signed their house because for some reason they couldn't sign it themselves. And they put it in their friend's name, a really, really good friend. That friend kicked them out of their own house, sold their house, and took all the money. And now they're living with family members, right?
That's not a friend.
That's definitely not a friend. But it's easy to say, wait a minute, I'm an Adventist. I'm trying to do what God wants me to do. Why is this happening to me, right? Why is this injustice? And God's answer is, listen, you might suffer now, but your reward is coming. And they might be prospering now, but trust me, their reward isn't going to be pretty, right? Their consequence, their judgment is going to be harsh. So, I think we just have to keep remembering this. We're going to go through tough times. So did Jesus. Jesus didn't deserve to be beaten, to be spat on, to die on the cross. But he went through it, right? He had to carry his cross, and he says that we have to carry ours. We have to trust in God that he has something better for us, right? That we do have a future, that there is justice in the end. All right, let's just read two more verses. Let me see if it's, let's read these two last verses, and then we'll read the second half next week. Anybody want to read these two here?
The kings of the heart who committed fornication and live luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, at last, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come.
All right, so it's that repeating, right? The idea that this happens suddenly, like the whole world's going to be shocked. When it happens, at the height of her strength, she falls, right? And it's interesting when it says that they weep, they do it from a distance, right? They don't want to suffer the same fate kind of a thing, because they know they're connected, right? They know that their riches also came from her. And so this is, this is very close to happening. What we're reading here today, I don't know when. I'm not a prophet. I can't give you dates, but the way the world is going, the way governments and economies and nature and everything, we're reaching this pinnacle, right? Everything seems to be, it's like blowing up a balloon. Like the balloon, you're looking at it and you're like, well, it's gonna pop at some point, right? We're reaching that extreme, and I think very, very soon we're gonna see this, right? We're gonna see everything crumble. Because
the smoke of her burning, is that her demise, not literal?
So in chapter 17, it says that they'll burn her. In chapter 18, it also says that she'll burn. It's possibly literal. It could be a literal event. It could be an actual fire that will just decimate,
because it was saying that the kings of the earth, they saw it.
Yeah, they see the smoke, right? It could be literal. It almost has to be more though, right? Because again, so much of our world is digital now, right? So you could burn down a bank, it doesn't make a difference. Your money isn't in the bank, right? It's on the cloud or whatever they call it. But I still think I think this is probably literal to a certain degree as well. I think it's probably both. I think there's definitely going to be a fire, something that the world is going to see, right? Like something visible that they'll see, wow, this just happened, right? It kind of reminds me of like September 11th, right? Like everyone in the world saw that plane smash into that building. Like everyone was watching TV and saw that event happen. And I think it's going to be something similar to that. Like the whole world will look at and mourn, right? This power that's just gone up in smoke. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yeah, I think she'll be destroyed, as it
yeah,
says. That
yeah.
is most likely some kind of burning. And that's, it says the 10 horns and the beast together will turn around
Will
and
do
will
it.
destroy her.
Yeah.
So there's something about Babylon will deceive the rest of these nations. And after a while, they will get smart and they will know exactly what she did with deception, and they'll turn around and they'll destroy her.
Yeah. And this isn't something that hasn't happened before, right? If you look through history, you know, the U.S. put Saddam Hussein in power, you know, let him go up in power, and then when it was time to take him out, they took him out. Gaddafi was the same way, right? So you have these powers that put other people up in power, and then when they're done with them, boom, they destroy them, right? So it's stuff that happens in the world already. So you know, this because next week when we read through more of it, it's going to give us a lot of details in terms of like what they buy and sell. And so it really does give you the sense that it's a literal destruction, right? It's a literal, you know, end of markets and countries and things like that. It's more than just a symbolic explanation. Like an actual place is going to burn, right? An actual country or city or whatever it is going to be destroyed, and the world is going to feel it. The whole world will get the consequence of it. Yeah.
So one of the things too we can keep in mind is that, remember we read in Revelation 13 that the lamb-like two-horned beast will create an image to the beast. This image is this beast with 10 horns and 7 heads. For some reason, she creates something that is identical.
Yeah.
And maybe this is what she creates. She rides. You know, she can get the rest of the world together because of her influence and create something similar with deception. Because remember, it says she make fire comes down from heaven and deceive the beast. And so they will get smart and realize what she has done. And they will turn around and they'll take this lamb-like two-horned beast, I believe, because that's all that we have at the ending of time is the 7-head, 10-horned beast plus the lamb-like beast, the deceiver. And these two exist. And I think that the deceiver or the false prophet is the one that is calling the shots, influencing and riding the beast, actually. And she's the one that will pay the penalty in the end.
That will pay the final penalty. Yep. Yep. All right, let's leave it here because I do want to have time for prayers. Let me stop.